Thank you so much. My own response. So first, thank you so much, Professor Munira Alatas, for these important interventions. I just posted in the chat an article by one of our authors in the special issue who directly addresses some of your concerns. Unfortunately, he is Professor Ramon Guillermo of UP Diliman. Unfortunately, couldn't be with us today. But yeah, I completely agree. We have to think much more like activists. So there's, I think, two strands of idea. One is the idea of autonomous social sciences, autonomous knowledge production, which was spearheaded by Professor Syed Hussein Alatas and also Professor Syed Farid Alatas, who we are glad to welcome today also. Um, and this need to talk to our deans and the leaders of our institutions and convince them that we have to have autonomous knowledge production in the global south, where we serve the people, we center the marginalized groups in our own country, and we think about how can we create knowledge that benefits them. And then as a second step, we want to have a South-South dialogue, and that will be socially just and relevant knowledge. And we have to explain to our leaders of our universities, our administrators, if we constantly run after the global north. I'm speaking we based in the Philippines. I don't know if I can claim we, but I'm yes. If the global south constantly chases after the global north and constantly tries to fill their research agendas, which are often selfish, which are often racist, which often center around the needs of the most privileged people on the planet, then we will spend a lot of taxpayers' money and we will not do things that serves global south communities, right? So this is the first step. The second step is I personally feel also the global south has to decolonize the global north, because even if we delink, even if the global south does autonomous knowledge production, the global north holds so much military power, economic power, funding, and everything. They control the World Bank, the IMF, all these NATO, the UN. They develop all this development goals, which Professor Sabelo Ndlovu-Gacheni has written about how development studies is very deeply Eurocentric and does not serve the interests of the global south, who is with us today. So even if we decolonize amongst our own here in the global south and ignore the global north, they will keep on pushing these very toxic policies, such as Archer Capistrano in the second panel will also illustrate. They will keep making imperialist wars. They will keep extracting our economies. So we also have to somehow go to the global north and tell them you cannot decolonize without us. You cannot neoliberalize academia, and you have to listen to the global south if you want to do social just scholarship, and if not, then you're just being greedy and selfish. And this is really exhausting and time consuming. There are spaces to talk to journal editors or journal boards. There are spaces to talk to conference organizers. We're happy to have Vandana Porkayasta with us, who is very active in both the International Sociological Association and the American Sociological Association. So in the second panel, where she will also speak, I will ask her for tips, because I've been trying to decolonize ASA and ISA, or work towards that for years. It's so exhausting. It's very hard to get time to speak with the people. Then they're rotating the leadership. So even in the conferences, it takes so much time to just get a foot in the door. So that's why I want to brainstorm also about concrete interventions. Yeah, if anyone has suggestions or ideas, they will be most appreciated. We will hear from Firoza Alam very briefly, then we'll have a break, and then we will start our second panel. Firoza, the floor is all yours.
Okay. Can we also have a comment from Professor Alatas?
Maybe at the start of the second panel.
I would very much like to hear from Professor Alatas, because my research was about language, and there was something that I quickly wanted to mention, that in the Canadian context, the indigenous scholars are talking about indigenous resurgence, which is very different from decoloniality or anti-colonial movement. So, and Taika Alfred is particularly one of the leading scholars in the field of indigenous resurgence, where he talks about spiritual sovereignty. So, from the perspective of language, particularly, what the indigenous, a lot of the scholars are, recommending or suggesting, strongly doing, is that they're denying to write in colonialist language. They're denying to write in English. They're denying to seek a degree or recognition from the Western colonial universities, because what they argue is that the settler colonialism and the other colonialism, they're connected, because the settler colonialism actually supports and extracts the resources of another colonialism. So they are connected. So it's not possible you just Fanny Lou Hamer. Nobody's free until everybody's free.
Yeah, thank you so much for this, and I really agree. I'm also torn between should we just delink or should we intervene with the global north? Professor Alatas, do you want to chime in briefly?
Yes, thank you, Carolina. Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple of comments with regard to some issues that were raised during the last 2 hours or so. So one comment is about what we think is central to decolonization. And I think that in all the years or decades that we have been talking about decolonizing knowledge, we have been involved in critiquing Eurocentric knowledge or colonial knowledge, but we have given less attention to the advocacy of colonialism and also the advocacy of neocolonialism. And I think these have actually become very important topics. In other words, I think, okay, let me put it this way. I think we are experiencing, I'm not sure whether this is going to become a trend in the future, but what I see now is that there seems to be a revival of pro-colonial discourse. Now, this pro-colonial discourse, there are at least two aspects to it. One aspect is there is a discourse which provides a positive evaluation of the history of colonialism. So scholars who write about colonialism of the past, India before independence, Indonesia before independence, and so on and so forth. So in their works, they provide a positive evaluation of neocolonialism. The idea that neocolonialism, there were some issues, some problems, but the net effect was positive. So a great example is the Scottish, I think he's Scottish, Niall Ferguson, who talks about British colonial history in a very positive light. And there are many other examples. And you have some of that in Bruce Gilley as well. But the other dimension of pro-colonial thought, which I think is more dangerous, is the kind associated with Bruce Gilley, which is not just providing a positive evaluation of the history of colonialism, but is calling for a restoration of colonialism. This is very, very, very dangerous. And even more dangerous is the fact that it's not confined to academia. Because if you listen, I've been talking a lot nowadays about the speech of Marco Rubio at the Munich Security Conference in February, where he was basically glorifying European colonialism. He was glorifying the colonial founding of America without once mentioning the genocide that the Europeans perpetrated against Native Americans. And he was calling for basically, a restoration of those days of glory. And if you look at the discourse, the way some of the members of the American cabinet are speaking in the context of this war, the war on Gaza, the war on Iran, you find very Orientalist, colonial type of discourse. So pro-colonial thought is not just confined to academia. It is something which informs policymakers, policy analysts, and politicians. And when it informs politicians who are in charge of the machinery of the most powerful nation on earth, this is really very, very dangerous. And we see the practice of it. I mean, the abduction of the Venezuelan president and his wife, the blockade of Cuba, and now the blockade of Iran, and President Trump has said that they're going to take Cuba after he finishes with Iran. So this is, I think, this is recolonization taking place in a very, material manner, and I think we should pay attention to that. Which brings me to my next point. This whole idea of being in a post-colonial world. Well, we are not in a post-colonial world. We are, as President Sukarno said in Bandung, and Mao Zedong also around the same time, said that we are still existing within a colonial situation. So they called it neocolonialism. Both Sukarno and Mao Zedong used the terms neocolonialism. So let's sort of maybe give more attention to neocolonialism as our human condition, as a description or a reference to our human condition, and then as a result revive interest in those very important topics that were discussed decades ago but became out of fashion in the social sciences and humanities today. I'm talking about imperialism. The study of imperialism, both economic, political imperialism, as well as intellectual imperialism. These were, I think, very important topics. If you are studying sociology, political economy, geography in the 1980s, you would definitely, if you were a graduate student those days in the US or in the UK, in France, these were staple topics in many disciplines in social sciences and humanities. But now it's gone out of fashion. Just when the phenomenon itself is so important, as important as it was in the past. And my last point is that I think, and this relates to what Dr. Fatima was saying about not wanting to publish in high impact journals. You are right. We have a very false, and as academics, we have a false sense of prestige. We find it so great to publish in high impact journals when the impact on the world is very minimal, a very low impact actually. When you think of the impact it has on the world outside academia, and maybe we should think more about having an impact on the world, which means it would be necessary to be public intellectuals, talking, involved in all kinds of, there are different, of course, levels of it, and depends on which levels suit us. Do we want to be involved in advocacy, in policy analysis? Do we want to be involved in, what do you call this thing? Civil disobedience? Do we want to be involved in social movements? Do we want to be involved in the media? And so I think there are so many ways in which one can be involved, in where we can play a role in conscientizing people outside of academia. For example, this thing about neocolonialism, I've hardly ever heard it being discussed in the media, even in the alternative media. Right? We've hardly ever heard it. And then the other thing, my favorite example, Israeli occupation. Even the non-Western media, the Arab media, for example, uses the term occupation, when it's not occupation, it's full-blown colonialism. Many forms of colonialism that Israel perpetrates, semi-colonialism in Gaza, settler colonialism in Israel proper, and so on and so forth. And also occupation, because they're occupying part of Lebanon and Syria. So you have occupation, but you also have colonialism. Yet why does the media use occupation as if to say it's merely occupation? It's a lot more than occupation. So we can go on and on with so many examples. So I really think decolonization should go beyond academia. It should go beyond discursive decolonization. It should be about decolonizing the material world, and maybe that is how I want to say our generation, but I think our time is coming to an end. I mean, hopefully not too soon, but the younger ones, those of you who are in your 30s and 40s, maybe your generation is the generation to take this decolonization discourse to another level. Because I think we haven't done that in the last 50, 60 years. We've been talking more about decolonizing discourse rather than actually decolonizing the material world. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Alatas, for these very important thoughts. It's time for our next panel, and I don't want the panelists to wait, but by all means, let's please continue the discussion after the next panel. So the next panel will be moderated by Dr. Tamari Kitosa, who is also a co-guest editor of our special issue. He is a professor of sociology and graduate program director for the MA in critical sociology in Brock University, Canada. He is editor and contributor to Appealing Because He is Appalling, Black Masculinities, Colonialism, and Erotic Racism, and co-editor and contributor to Nuances of Blackness in the Canadian Academy, Teaching, Learning, and Researching While Black. And he is one of the main figures writing on decolonization, decolonial criminality, and anti-racism in Canada. So we're very thrilled to have him as a guest editor for the special issue. And he will, I'll hand over to him now to moderate, and he will call on the individual presenters, and of course, any presenters are welcome to show slides if you want, and then afterwards we'll continue the discussion. So Tamari, floor is all yours.
Thank you, Caroline. Just a quick question. Is there going to be a break? Because on the schedule that I have, I see a break, and I wonder if the participants...
We were supposed to have a break, but we filled the break with a very spirited and important discussion. Okay. So I would just say, for those who need a break, just switch off your camera and go have a short break. But I think in the interest of time, let's maybe continue right here.
Okay. Thank you, Caroline, for that very warm introduction. And I tuned in and I caught some of the discussion. I found it very intellectually stimulating. So I'm looking forward to more of this interesting dialogue. So the title for this panel is Eurocentrism, Coloniality of Power and Biased Policymaking. Before we begin, I'd like to express my gratitude to Caroline and the other members of the editorial team for inviting me to participate in helping to edit the special issue. These are a wonderful collection of scholarly works, and I think that they're definitely making and will make a contribution, particularly since this will be now in book form for others to engage with the discussion around decolonization of knowledge and the coloniality of power and epistemology. So without taking up further time, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Sabelo Nadlovu Gacheni. The title of the paper is Intellectual Imperialism and Decolonization in African Studies. Dr. Sabello, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Tamari Kitosa, for the introduction, and thank you to meet you. We have exchanged some emails, but we have not met physically. It's great to see your face, and thank you to all who attended. Of course, after listening to the first panel. I have so many things in my head, but let me try to first of all talk about my own my own piece. I wrote this piece while I was working at the University of Bayreuth in Germany, so it has some context in it, in the sense that when I was in Bayreuth, I was a professor and a chair in epistemologies of the Global South with emphasis on Africa. But my primary duty was actually in the Africa multiple cluster of excellence, which was focused on two issues. The overarching agenda was reconfiguring African studies. And that reconfiguring African studies, it had to reconfigure at two levels. One at the institutional level, in which instead of Africanists meeting in Germany, thinking about Africa without Africans, we needed to have links with institutions in Africa. And then the second level of reconfiguring was how to bring in the voices, the methodologies, and the theories from Africa into the African studies. Basically, in summary, it was about how to do African studies with Africans rather than Africanists doing African studies sort of from outside, and then the knowledge permeating into the continent. So I had this big task of trying to facilitate this so-called reconfiguring of African studies, and my own contribution was to bring the decolonization aspect to the reconfiguration of African studies. So this piece of work which appears in this special issue must be understood within that spirit of reconfiguring African studies. And my entry point, in the way I framed the piece, I framed it in using four concepts, and already I had colleagues speaking to some of the issues. The first concept which I used to frame was the cognitive empire, to speak to the issues of intellectual imperialism, and the cognitive empire which invades the mental universe of its victims, and they introduce particular ways of knowing, particular ways of thinking, and the particular ways of understanding the world. And I think colleagues in the first panel have spoken to that very eloquently. And also that cognitive empire producing a coloniality of knowledge. But the third concept which I tried to bring to frame that piece was also what we call, what others have called the Africanist enterprise, and I think that need to be clarified, because for the African studies, the Africanist enterprise is the is the dominant way of production of knowledge about Africa, which is produced outside Africa by those who study Africa from outside. And they are linked to endowments, to these funders. They have the money, they have the resources to do research in Africa, and they produce canonical texts, which are actually the central resources for understanding Africa. And so that is what the Africanist enterprise is about. And it is about scholars who are based mainly in Ivy League institutions in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and other places, who, when it becomes winter, they go to Africa under the guise of doing field work, and they go there. Normally they say to do field work, but to do extractive work, and they then produce these canonical texts, produce models and the theories, which are then consumed on the continent. I'm not sure, because here there is a dominance of people from Asia, from Southeast Asia, whether we can also speak about an Asianist enterprise. People studying Southeast Asia and Asia from outside. From listening to the speakers, it looks like they are located in the universities in Southeast Asia and in Asia. I even heard somebody who is speaking about Asia from outside. But in Africa, the leading lights of the thought, sometimes they are more concentrated in the United States, in the UK, and the other places. So that Africanist enterprise, we also wanted to deal with it, to make sure that the voices of the scholars based on the continent itself are also part of the driving forces of Africanist thought. Then the fourth concept which I used to frame this article is what I termed the decolonial trends, and I will speak about them. I'll speak about them later. With those 4 vantage points, I actually tried to explain all of them and how they impact on African studies, and particularly how they impact on our formation and our consciousness as African scholars, particularly in the way we relate to knowledge or the way we generate knowledge. And I tried to distill some positionalities which are very problematic, our own positionalities as African scholars, particularly the first position which I tried to distill is what I called the radical assimilationist position, in which the African scholars themselves, they assimilate the protocols, the methodologies, and the theories which are generated from the global north, and they adhere to those standards, and they try to outperform even the Eurocentric thinkers in their own game, and that being what we're talking about here is seeking validation and legitimacy from outside, and that is very common, just to be a good scholar, what they call you a good scholar, the one who you are not subjective, you are objective, you are contributing to universal truth, whatever that means. There is that positionality, and that positionality is still dominant in African studies. And then there is I'm pitching that because one of my colleagues from University of Beirut, Hamiso, who is here, spoke about his experience about his paper, which was immediately pushed out under the guise of saying it was subjective, not objective, and the aggressive manner in which it was dismissed and pushed out of considerations for publications, not by Europeans, but by other African scholars who adhere to this thing which I call radical assimilation of the protocols and the Eurocentric ways of producing knowledge, and they refuse literally to listen to alternative arguments. They actually judge instead of actually trying to understand what others are trying to bring on the table. And that's a very problematic positionality which we need to deal with if we are to move in the direction of decolonizing. Because we are maintaining that even without direct juridical colonialists forcing it on us. Then the other one which I wanted to talk about is what I called the liminarity, to be in between, to just operate in between, trying to both assimilate the Western and also to bring the African. There is also that problematic positionality of in-betweenness in terms of the attitude towards knowledge and the understanding of knowledge itself. Then the most dangerous one is what I will call the compradorial position. The compradorial position is one whereby one seeks just to survive within the academy. And you seek to survive within the academy by pandering to the power dynamics, the scholarship fashions, and you avoid speaking truth to power, so to speak, in order to survive. And most of what we call compradorial scholarship, it's a scholarship which actually works against the very person who is producing it, the very people where this person emerges from, and that is also very, very common in African studies. And then there is a third, if not a fourth one, radical difference. Scholars who become angry because of what we call Eurocentrism, coloniality, cognitive empire, and they want to disengage from what they call the European game, and they try to say we have our own knowledge systems, and the major problem there is how to navigate this positionality in such a way that you don't then disengage from the world of knowledge itself, and then you end up falling into what we call nativism, epistemic xenophobia, and even ghettoization, so to speak. But I understand their anger. I understand the why they end up in that position. But we need to be careful with that position as well. And then, of course, what we are talking about today is a decolonial position, which is a long-standing positionality in knowledge production, whereby the issue is really not to be included in what Fanon calls the European game, but to actually question the very rules of the game itself, and to challenge those rules of the game so as to reconstitute knowledge. And I think that's what maybe in Malaysia they speak about as autonomous knowledge, or something like that, so that we move away from seeking to be included in the game without questioning the terms, the protocols, and the rules. So that is one issue which I highlighted in that paper. The other issue which I highlighted in that paper, which I think is very important, and is important in the context after listening to the first panel of the presenters, whereby we need also to understand. I'm not sure in Southeast Asia and in Asian studies, the issue of generations of scholars. There's something which we need to think about also about the issue of generations of scholars. In African studies, Thandika Mkandawire, a Malawian scholar, wrote a piece some time ago about the 3 generations of African scholars. And in this generation, he spoke about the first generation being those who studied in America, in Europe, those Africans who studied there, and who became part of the anti-colonial liberation struggles, and who then came back home at the dawn of political independence. He was actually praising them for being very rigorous, having been trained by very rigorous Western scholars, and they were able to publish in what Fatima was speaking about in these high impact journals in the global north, setting a very high standard in African studies and in African history. He also came to the second generation about those African scholars who did undergraduate studies on the African continent. Then they did postgraduate studies outside. And then, of course, those ones, they emerged at a time when there was the rise of Marxist thought. So most of them, they were leftist thinkers. And they came back also to the continent, and they maintained very high scholarship, publishing in high impact journals. But they were then frustrated by maybe the rising dictatorships within the continent, as well as the collapsing economies. So they went back to where they trained, and they joined Ivy League universities there. Then he had very serious concerns about what he called the third generation. I think I might actually belong to that generation. The third generation is those people who were trained on the continent from undergraduate up to PhD. And his argument was that they have no exposure, international exposure, and their scholarship was not all that good. Their writing, so they find it difficult to publish in these high impact journals. Obviously, he ended with he was writing during his time. He ended with three generations. I think there might be 4 or 5 now generations of those scholars. But I'm raising these generational issues because we had problems. I've been involved in these struggles for decolonization from Zimbabwe, where I was born, from South Africa, where I spent. I'm a permanent resident of South Africa. I spent many years in the South African Academy before I moved to Germany, and before I moved to where I am in Canada. And I know that we had problems with our earlier generations who were saying, but we did this issue of decolonizing long ago. What are you talking about again? We did it in Ibadan, we did it in Dar es Salaam, we did it in Maputo, we did it in all these places. What are these young people talking about now? They are just trying to destroy the high level of intellectualism which is remaining on the continent. And they were trying to engage with them to say, but we are carrying over a struggle which we think is unfinished. But they had no much confidence that we have the capacity to carry that struggle forward because of our poor training in the poor African universities. So every time our works has been judged, our argument has been subjected to serious judgments that they are not rigorous enough. Rigor started with us, it ended with us. You people, you are not rigorous. So I'm highlighting that. I'm not sure whether in other spaces you face that type of challenges. Of course, not everyone was like that. We have other senior scholars who really supported, and they said, you guys, you are carrying over a very necessary struggle which needed to be, and they joined in the struggle, and they were very happy that it was resurgent and insurgent, particularly in the context of the roads must fall and the fees must fall movements. A lot of people, a lot of debates re-emerged. Those who have been following those movements, they will also know that the students were being condemned for misreading Fanon and for misreading Steve Biko, as though there is a template of how to read them. But every generation has its own way of reading those canonical texts to distill the meaning which makes sense for them at their particular moment. So I tried to highlight that, but I also tried to bring in what I called the decolonial turns, which might not be adequate in understanding what I'm trying to speak about in African studies. But I wanted to talk about the decolonial turns in terms of documenting the African contributions to the advancement of African studies from inside the continent. It's a very complex terrain which I tried to navigate, because this is a terrain of pioneers in African studies. It is also the terrain of institutions which were built, which were introduced to advance African studies. It is also a terrain of intellectual traditions and movements, as well as the terrain of schools of thought. So what I tried to map out in that paper, I tried to bring in the overarching a black radical tradition, and to say all the initiatives which are pushing the African studies agenda, they must be understood within that broader tradition. So I distilled the African nationalist turn in African studies, which was pushed more vigorously from Ibadan, the Ibadan school in the 1960s, in the 1970s. Particularly, I'm more familiar with the historians, Kenneth DK, Jacob Adeajayi, Toyin Falola, and the others who were pushing for African nationalist historiography to dethrone the colonial historiography. And that became a very popular school, and I'm also trained within that context. And that was also working in tandem with what for lack of a better term, I will call the Afro-Marxist turn, which was more pronounced at the University of Dar es Salaam, the Dar es Salaam school, where there was scholars like Walter Rodney, scholars like Semia Amin, Mahmoud Mamdani, Issa Shivji, Majori, and many others. Even Angela Davis, I think, was there for some time, and many other scholars, which were pushing from a political economy and a class analysis and a writing history from below. And then there was also the Afrocentric turn, which was more pronounced in Dakar, particularly the work of Cheikh Anta Diop and the others. And of course, for the sake of time, I will just move very fast. Obviously, by the late 1970s, going forward, we have the rise of the neoliberal project, and also a neoliberal turn in scholarship, with some scholars actually pushing from that angle. And then that one followed quickly by the post-colonial turn. And the issue is also to be nuanced in the way we other people, they use the term decolonial and the post-colonial interchangeably, as though it means the same thing. But I think we need to try to distinguish the two movements in terms of the genealogy, in terms of the trajectories, and in terms of the horizons, so that we don't just mix things. But it's a complex debate, because the post-colonial turn might actually include some scholars like V.Y. Mudimbe, Invention of Africa, The Idea of Africa, the scholars like Achille Mbembe on the post-colony and the others. And where do you put scholars like Ngugi Thiongo, Chinwe Inzu, scholars like Dani Nabutere on Africology and others? Can we just say they are post-colonial because they were writing maybe during the 1980s onwards? And of course, we must not forget another 10 in African studies, which is a very important 10 in the sense which we need to think about very deeply, particularly in decolonization, which is the feminist 10 in African studies, whereby they were bringing in forcefully the idea that any African studies which ignores 52% of the population's contribution is an impoverished African studies. And there is a lot of scholarship, with the most celebrated one being the scholarship of Oironke Oyeumi, the invention of African of women, where he uses the Yoruba case study to enlighten us on the whole question of gender. And then, of course, the decolonial turn becomes very interesting because it is now resurgent and insurgent. This is why we are actually meeting here to speak about the issues which some think they've been thought of before. But before I stop, I wanted also to say this paper was also written within a context in which there was a search for understanding the future of African studies. What is the future of African studies? Is the future of African studies going to go the direction of critical African studies? And we already have a journal, Critical African Studies, which pushes that agenda of critical African studies. And should the decolonial African studies be subsumed under critical African studies? I'm not giving answers here, but that's a direction which African studies is actually taking, the possibility. And then the second one is the African studies. And this one, you need to link it to the establishment of the African Studies Association of Africa in 2013 in Accra, where they were trying to say even the associations of African studies are actually from outside, and we don't have one within the continent. And that's when that one was formed for Africans to study themselves. And if you link that with the work of the Maori scholar Linda Tuai Smith, who asked this fundamental question: what changes when the indigenous becomes the scholar of the indigenous societies? And this also, you must link it with the question: what changes when the African actually studies Africa? And he says what happens is that the perspective changes, the methodologies changes, the approaches changes, the positionality changes. And he says if you don't see that change taking place, then you are actually embedded in another game. We are not actually doing it. If you are doing it correctly, everything needs to change. And then the other possibility is being pushed by the leading light of African Studies and African History, Toyin Falola, who is based at the University of Texas in the US, who is introducing this idea of ancestral studies, which might actually give birth to ancestral African studies. Then, of course, there are Africanists based in Kika in the in Germany, who were pushing this possibility of comparative African studies. And myself and the two colleagues at the University of Bayreuth, we responded to one of the propositions about this issue of comparative African studies. And our paper is in Africa Spectrum, where we actually critiqued this position. And then I want to end with maybe one or two reflections on the strategies. Remember, you asked about what are the strategies to move forward in this. I think from what I've done in this paper, one strategy is that we need to be hard on ourselves in the first instance. We need to make sure we work on ourselves to regain. From my own work, I've been pushing this idea of epistemic freedom, and which I defined as the ability to think as ourselves, to write as ourselves from where we are, from our own vantage points, without this issue which Fatima was talking about of always seeking legitimation from somewhere. And I think also the other issue which has emerged from Shazeb Khan and others in the last presentation is the challenge of institutional change. We need to also make sure that the decolonization which we are pursuing really result in institutional change. And I'm one person who was actually involved in South Africa in the attempt to do institutional changes. And I must tell you, it is not a walk in the park. It is very, very difficult because institutions posture. They posture as though they want to change, but they actually absorb change into the known. And they destroy really radical changes as they come through committees, through everything. It needs to go through committees, through existing structures of the university. And once you work through those, you end up disciplined yourself rather than you actually changing what you intended to change at the beginning. And then the other issue which I must say is that we need to take the Southern theories, Southern methodology, and the Southern thought very serious ourselves. Nobody will take it serious except ourselves if we want really to change these issues. And we need to actually change our own positionality. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sabello. That was a wonderfully detailed account of your paper, and I look forward to the discussion that we'll have following. Thank you so much. Caroline, I don't see Archil. Oh, I see Archil. Okay, good. Thank you. So Archil Capistrano, the paper for Archil is Traversing the Intersections of Decoloniality and Liquid Modern Consumerism in Human Trafficking. So Archil, Dr. Archil, looking very much forward to hearing your comments about your paper and the discussion that will follow. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Let me time myself. All right. Warm greetings, everyone. Permit me first to thank the Center for Critical Peace Studies and the Pluriversity Lahore for bringing this launch to fruition and making this cerebral conversation happen, for the opportunity to contribute to the special issue and the chance to talk about it in this launch. Caroline and Fatima, daghang salamat. Now onto my paper. When we talk about human trafficking, we often picture a clear-cut story of villains and victims. We look at maps highlighting the global south as the source of the problem and look to the global north for the solution. But today, or tonight for some of us, we are here to look into a mirror. My research invites us to see human trafficking not just as a crime, but as a demonstration of the ills associated with what Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman calls liquid modernity, by which there is a shift from stable, institutionally guaranteed life conditions to a society of uncertainty, flexibility, and debounding. It creates freedoms, but it also creates new forms of precarity and isolation. Among the modern world's precarities is intensified human mobility, which includes digital mobility or interconnectedness. In the contemporary world, characterized as a Westphalian capitalist neoliberal world order, this mobility has been turned into a commodity. This commodification is exemplified by the thriving labor migration industry that is matched by the assumption that mobility brings about prospects for prosperity, or what is also known as the Cinderella syndrome. Meanwhile, financial security is a must in a world that is increasingly becoming consumerist, where power tends to be understood as the ability to consume, which on the flip side is vulnerability to be consumed. My paper entitled Traversing the Intersections of Decoloniality and Liquid Modern Consumerism in Human Trafficking contributes, hopefully, to the decolonial thinking by exposing how our current globally recognized policies, especially in the context of human trafficking, are actually built on old colonial foundations. The first contribution this article highlights is the profound bias towards the supply side. If you look at the major global reports, like those from the US State Department, meaning the Trafficking in Persons Report, or the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which is the biennial Global Trafficking in Persons Report, you'll notice a repetitive formula. The 3 Ps plus R, meaning prosecution, protection, prevention, and repatriation. These policies focus almost entirely on the countries where victims come from. They rank these nations on tier lists, or well, basically the US State Department's Trafficking in Persons, more particularly. So tier lists, which basically discipline countries if they don't secure enough criminal convictions or don't kowtow to the standards on the US's Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or TVPA. Why is this a problem? It is a problem because it treats human trafficking as a global South problem that the West must fix. This is what the paper calls the coloniality of power, or situates as coloniality of power, a way of saying that the West has set itself up as the lawgiver and warden of the world while ignoring its own role in the crisis. By focusing only on the supply, we ignore the demand that makes the industry profitable in the first place. My article also introduces the idea of liquid modern consumerism. In our world, the power to consume is becoming an ultimate mark of status. Those who cannot afford to consume are labeled as flawed consumers. The paper presents excerpts that show how deep Filipinos' digital engagement is despite slow internet speed. This is, for me, a researcher, alarming because it is symptomatic of the precarity by which flawed consumers are often forced to commodify their own bodies or the bodies of their children just to participate in a global consumerist culture, a situation that exemplifies also the coloniality of being. A striking example I present in the paper is Sweetie, a digital avatar of a 10-year-old Filipino girl child created by TWQ, a Dutch NGO, to catch predators. While successful at unmasking demand for sex by 1,000 pedophiles in just a month from Sweetie's deployment in 2013, my paper went beyond law enforcement and civil liberties organizations' critiques on jurisdiction and criminal evidence by arguing that Sweetie's creation appropriates global South victimhood to solve a problem that remains rooted in demand from the global North. It turns the notorious marketability of Filipino children for sex into a tool of a Western-led sting operation, further showing how the global South is used as a laboratory for Western solutions. This leads us to a central provocative concept in my paper, what I call the white man's cause. From Kipling's White Man's Burden of Civilizing the World, I coined the phrase white man's cause with a double sense to describe a deep hypocrisy in international policy. First, the mission. It is the West's cause or civilizing mission to save the world from trafficking on its own terms, often through carrot and stick diplomacy and aid that forces global South countries to comply with Western standards. Second, the culprit. Paradoxically, it is caused by the insatiable consumer demand for sex coming from the global North. For example, while the Philippines is often shamed for being a hub for digital human trafficking or online sexual exploitation, the money fueling this abuse is traced directly back to the US, Australia, Canada, and the UK. The white man's cause points out that while the West plays the hero, it is also the primary customer. To wrap up, my article isn't just about human trafficking. It's a call to dismantle global North centrism in knowledge production and policy on human trafficking. It challenges us to stop victim blaming the global South and look more seriously at the demand pull from the global North. It asks us to recognize that our current punitive policies, which focus on borders and jails, are solid solutions that cannot catch liquid realities of a globalized, consumer-driven market. If we want to truly address human trafficking, we must stop treating it as a charity case for the West to solve and start addressing the systemic hunger for consumption that makes human beings disposable in the very first place. A very important quote: people were created to be loved. Things were created to be used. The reason why the world is in chaos is because things are being loved and people are being used. Thank you very much for lending me your ears.